don't rise to the level of meeting the rigorous standards of skepticism. It's like saying, oh, well, that's scientism. You're only willing to accept whatever science is. Well, that's a fine challenge to scientism from the people who have ideas that don't rise to the level of science. All skepticism is I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible, and I'd like to use the mechanisms available to do that, which includes scientific inquiry and good standards of evidence.
All right, folks, welcome back. So glad you decided to click on this one because I genuinely think this exchange is something special. We have Dr. Kenny Rhodess, a theologian with a PhD who specializes in the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas, sitting down with Matt Dillahunty from the Atheist Experience on the Modern Day Debate Channel to tackle one of the oldest questions in philosophy: is there actually good evidence for God? Kenny comes in with one of the most sophisticated philosophical frameworks you will hear in this kind of debate, and Matt comes in ready to pull the whole thing apart from the foundation up. Do yourself a favor and stick all the way through this one, because the moment this builds toward is the kind of thing that reframes how you think about the entire conversation. Before we jump in, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from right now. Seriously, it could be anywhere, and I always love seeing it. It genuinely means something every single time someone takes a moment to do that. Okay, let us get into it.
Skepticism is actually a metaphysical disease. I don't mean to be rude to Matt in any way by suggesting that. But again, you cannot answer the issue of God or answer the issue of the bigger picture of reality by virtue of cutting off a part of what is and then examining that and think that you can answer questions concerning the whole. When we examine reality, we see that reality is necessarily composite. We have parts. Human beings have parts. We have parts such as substance and accidents, matter, form, things of that sort. When we look at reality or being as being, or the nature of what it is to be an existent being, we know that we are composite, and that necessarily, as Plato says, it takes us back to the one, or unity necessarily grounds multiplicity. And by way of deduction, by way of abduction, we can look at the nature of reality and walk that back and say it must be grounded in that which is one, that which is unity, and that which can ground all multiplicity. As a matter of fact, any existential reality necessarily must be grounded in existential absoluteness. And that is by definition what we call God. I want to answer a question that I've heard Matt ask many, many times. Which God are you debating today? And I want to help him clear up this issue, because when Muslims, Jews, Christians, and even the ancient Greeks, when we speak of monotheism, we are speaking of the God who is, and we're making a distinction ontologically speaking. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and the ancient Greek philosophers, we are all referring to the only possible monotheistic being who is really outside of the category of being itself. He necessarily is existence himself. We speak of God as simple, which simply means that his essence, what it means for him to be, is identical to existence, and existence is identical to his essence. When we define things, we define them according to essences, and so I'm going to be necessarily bringing in, and I can defend it as well, that things have essences, things have natures, and what a thing is and that a thing is are distinct. And that is the greatest composition that we find in reality. What a thing is and that a thing is. We can know what a thing is regardless of whether or not we know it exists. Kant, as a matter of fact, said that existence is not a predicate. And that's actually the problem with Anselm's ontological argument. It treats existence as if it was a predicate. but existence is actually that which causes essences to exist. We might say that, put it in Thomistic terms, it is the actus essendi composed with an essence that brings something into existence. And I can know things simply by looking at what they are or contemplating what they are. And I can define a unicorn, which there's nothing logically irrational about a unicorn existing. But what's wrong? That essence of unicorn has not been composed with an act of existence, therefore it doesn't exist. Dinosaurs, I wanted to do a poking joke at my young earth creationist friends, but I won't. Dinosaurs, they did exist, but they existed quite a long time ago, but they no longer exist. I can still define them according to the essence of what a dinosaur is. And to cite Boethius, he says, that which is and what a thing is are distinct, not separated, but distinct. He said, esse and id quod est are distinct. So that is the direction I'm going tonight. I'm sure we'll have an interesting discussion. I just want to conclude my opening statement with this. Necessarily, and I'm not defining God into existence, but what I'm saying is when we look at the fact that all that is composed of what it is and that it is, we necessarily can walk backward to the one who is essence and existence, and it is identical with one another. And logically, you must have that. You have to have one that grounds all existence to give rise to all the multiplicity that we see in reality. And I'll conclude at that moment. I don't know how long I went, but
got 4 minutes left if you want them, but
that's all right. No,
you got it. No problem. Works. And want to let you know, folks, we are thrilled to let you know for the first time about this juicy upcoming debate, Islam on Trial. Apostate Prophet will be here with a surprise guest next month. You don't want to miss it, folks. So if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you can catch up. You can catch more juicy debates coming up. And with that, thanks so much for being with us again. Matt, the floor is all yours.
This is where the debate begins, and honestly, the opening from Kenny Rhodes is more revealing than he probably intended, because Kenny comes in with a full Thomistic philosophical framework: classical theism, composite reality, essence and existence as distinct, unity grounding multiplicity. And it sounds incredibly sophisticated on the surface, but here's the thing that immediately stands out. Kenny says that any existential reality must be grounded in what he calls existential absoluteness, and then says that is by definition what we call God. By definition. He is not arguing toward God. He is defining God into the conclusion before the argument even begins. That is the move happening here, and it matters enormously for everything that follows. You have to understand the structure of what Kenny is building. He is saying that because everything we see is composite, made of parts, there must be something that is not composite, that grounds all of it. He is using Plato, Boethius, Thomistic metaphysics, the real distinction between essence and existence. It is a genuinely old and serious philosophical tradition, and for centuries, this kind of argument was considered essentially unanswerable. Here is something worth knowing that puts this in context. This style of argument comes from Aristotle's concept of the unmoved mover, and was developed into Christian theology primarily by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Aquinas argued that contingent beings, things that exist but do not have to exist, must ultimately be grounded in a necessary being whose essence just is existence. Kenny is presenting a modern version of that same structure. The problem is that Matt Dillahunty has spent 16 years fielding exactly these kinds of arguments, and he has very specific responses to each layer of it. And crucially, Kenny has defined God as by definition the ground of existence, which means before a single piece of evidence has been presented, God has already been smuggled into the conclusion through the definition itself.
Awesome. I will try to take a similar amount of time so that nobody says anything about unfair. First of all, thank you everybody for having me back, and my apologies for the delay. I unfortunately got a really, like they listed it as atypical pneumonia, and I was over it inside of like 36 hours, but it was something to do with my heart that they were worried about. And then they ran a whole bunch of EKGs, and it turns out my heart's just fine. It was a bad reading or whatever. And so, yeah, I wound up recovering from the pneumonia. So thanks everybody for your patience. I'm always glad when we get to actually define terms a little bit. And I've hosted the Atheist Experience for 16 years, over 500 episodes, I just found out last week. And quite often you'll have someone who says that they can't present evidence for the existence of a God. That, in fact, some of them argue that God would not give evidence, because if God gave evidence, that would somehow violate your free will, that's a problem. And so I'm thrilled that today we're going to at least hear what God Kenny's talking about, what the good reasons are for that, and how and why he thinks reasons are good. I don't think it's going to surprise anybody that we're probably not going to disagree on what counts as good reasons. Not the least of which is that if you begin, and I wasn't offended at all, if somebody says that skepticism is a metaphysical disease, it doesn't surprise me that someone would view skepticism as a metaphysical disease if they're advocating for positions that don't rise to the level of meeting the rigorous standards of skepticism. It's like saying, oh, well, that's scientism. You're only willing to accept whatever science is. Well, that's a fine challenge to scientism from the people who have ideas that don't rise to the level of science. All skepticism is I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible, and I'd like to use the mechanisms available to do that, which includes scientific inquiry and good standards of evidence. We've solved this problem of what counts as good evidence in courtrooms and in science, and I'll touch on that just a little bit later. I had a receipt sitting here from a dry cleaner. I stopped off and dropped off 10 shirts today to be dry cleaned, because evidently we're getting out from underneath the Backstreet Boys reunion tour, or whatever we're supposed to call it, so that nothing gets demonetized. But if I were to show you the receipt, if I were to then say, do you have a good reason to believe that I own shirts? Do you have a good reason to believe that I dropped them off at the cleaner? Do you have a good reason to believe they'll be back on Tuesday? What are the other candidate explanations for this receipt that I have? Well, the truth is, all of us, I would hope, would say, of course, I have good reason to believe that you have shirts and you dropped them off and they'll be ready on Tuesday. That's what the receipt says. And we have good reason to believe that, despite the fact that all of us know I could fake a receipt. Like you don't know. Let me put Jack Brown cleaners on the top of something, print it off on the computer. It's not like it's as difficult as trying to counterfeit money. I could make a receipt. And yet still, even knowing that it could be fake, we're still reasonably assured that I probably dropped laundry off today. If for no other reason than it would seem absurd to try to fake a receipt, but we could have done it. Maybe I did it just to make a point in the debate. How can we investigate it? Well, in fact, we can. We can investigate, and even though we know some things are fake, we can figure out whether or not this one is. We can go in and talk to the cleaners. We can check video recordings. We can check to make sure that the numbers match up and that they've got the clothing and all this other stuff.
And then Matt Dillahunty walks in and does something that I find genuinely impressive. He does not get defensive. He does not get rattled. He takes the metaphysical disease comment, which Kenny directed at skepticism, and turns it completely around. He says something like, it does not surprise him that someone would call skepticism a disease if they are advocating for positions that do not rise to the level of skeptical standards. That is not a dismissal. That is a diagnosis. He is saying the reason you call skepticism a disease is because your position cannot survive it. And then comes the line that I think reframes the entire debate. Matt says all skepticism is wanting to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. That is it. That is the whole thing. It is not a closed system. It is not scientism. It is not closed-mindedness. It is just the commitment to not being wrong more than you have to be. This is the part that blows my mind. Kenny frames skepticism as a kind of intellectual arrogance, a metaphysical disease that prevents you from seeing the bigger picture. And Matt simply shows you what skepticism actually is and lets you decide whether that sounds like a disease or like the most reasonable thing a person could want for themselves. And then Matt does something pedagogically brilliant. He pulls out a dry cleaning receipt. He uses it to walk through how ordinary, everyday evidence works, why we believe things, what warrants belief, how we investigate claims that might be false. He is not being condescending. He is showing you that the standard he applies to God is the exact same standard he applies to everything else. He is not raising the bar for God. He is holding God to the same bar as the dry cleaner.
What we're trying to do is figure out, do I have a good reason to believe something? That's the whole of life. Every time somebody comes up and it says a claim to you, hey, I just got a new car yesterday. Do you sit there and go, hang on, please provide evidence that you got a new car yesterday? Well, at most, you're probably going to say, show me the car. Well, it's not here right now. They're doing some detailing on it. Does that mean you stop believing them? No. So it's not just about, hey, I heard something and, no, I won't believe anything. A lot of people confuse skepticism with cynicism. Cynicism is the I won't believe anything. And skepticism is I will believe those things that are warranted. And if you look at fallacies, one of the most common ones is to say, what other explanation is there? Isn't it either just chance or God? And somebody asked prior to this, why won't atheists just admit that they believe it's all chance? Well, in some cases, I believe chance is a perfectly acceptable explanation. In other cases, I don't think that chance is in fact a reasonable explanation, because when I look at the universe, it doesn't operate by chance. It operates according to the laws and the rules of physics and chemistry. It's not chance. Is it chance that something happened? Perhaps. But the right answer when somebody says, why is there something rather than nothing, for me, is I don't know. And if you think that's a dishonest answer, if it's incredibly frustrating for you that there are people who are willing to admit that they don't know, I would just ask you, I'm far more frustrated with the people who claim that they do know when they definitely don't. And there are people running around advocating for every God under the sun and some beyond it without knowing it. Now, a lot of you probably heard this tired old claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And in what that claim initially meant, it's true, but it's not quite true. The truth is all claims require pretty much the same evidence before it's reasonable to accept them. The difference is that some claims, from the instant they are made, already benefit from all sorts of evidence and baggage out there. If you say, hey, I just dropped my clothes off at the laundry, well, we have mountains of evidence that there are places where you can drop off the clothes, and all the little elements are already there. If you say instead, hey, last night I saw a ghost, well, all we've got so far is that we know people report seeing things that they call ghosts, but what evidence do we have that you saw a ghost? So what do we mean when we're talking about trying to collect evidence to determine whether or not something's reasonable? Because I am someone who believes that there needs to be good evidence. And I don't think that you can just start with some sort of description and work back and kind of argue that, therefore there must be some sort of necessary being. Because somewhere along the lines, somebody injected things like being and necessary and didn't always justify them.
And here is where Matt lands the closing challenge that the entire first half of this segment has been building toward. He addresses the false binary that comes up constantly in these conversations. The idea that if something was not just chance, then it must have been God. Matt points out he does not think everything is chance either. The universe operates according to laws of physics and chemistry. It is not random, but not random does not mean God. Those are not the only two options available. And then he says something that I think is one of the most honest things you will ever hear in a debate like this. When someone asks, why is there something rather than nothing? His answer is, I do not know. And he is not embarrassed by that. He says, if you find that frustrating, if you think that is a dishonest answer, then consider this. He is far more frustrated with the people who claim they do know when they definitively do not. That line lands differently when you think about what Kenny just spent 12 minutes doing. Kenny walked through Aristotle, Aquinas, Boethius, Plato, Theistic metaphysics, and arrived at God as the necessary grounding of all existence. And his answer to the question of why there is something rather than nothing is essentially God by definition. Matt is sitting across from that and saying, I would rather admit I do not know than pretend certainty I have not earned. And then the closing challenge, the thing that makes everything else snap into focus. Matt says you cannot start with a description and work backward to a necessary being because somewhere along the way, someone injected terms like being and necessary without justifying them. That is the exact problem with Kenny's entire framework. The conclusion was built into the premises from the beginning, and if you cannot falsify it, if there is no way to show it is wrong, then you do not have an argument. You have an assumption with philosophical vocabulary wrapped around it. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.